If you've been watching the news over the last several weeks, you're probably aware that there's a lot of concern about the status of American and NATO forces in Afghanistan after 2014. As you know, President Obama originally said that we would have all forces out of Afghanistan by the end of that year. However, we've been in negotiations with the Afghan government for several months, if not years, trying to arrive at a status of forces agreement that we can live with and they can live with. You may have been shocked, as I was the other day, when the supposed three top experts from the Obama government were testifying in the House of Representatives and were unable to answer a couple of basic questions. One being, how much does it cost us in Afghanistan this year, 2013, and how many Americans have been killed in their line of duty over the last year? Three top experts were unable to answer those simple questions. So, I thought it might be useful if you're confused as to, well, what side should we be on? Gosh golly, we've been there for over 10 years. We can't just walk away from it because we have to bring Western ways to Afghanistan. We certainly have to make sure that all those schools that we built and all the young ladies that are going to those schools continue to be educated, and all of these concerns. So a couple of things that I fall back on, and they both happen to be history, in history. Machiavelli, if you went to public schools or college, you probably read The Prince, but you probably didn't read another book which I find is far more important for our purposes, and that's called Discourses, or the Discourses on Livy. Livy was a historian of the Roman Republic, and Machiavelli in around the 1500s, early 1500s, went back and uncovered these histories of the Roman Republic that was roughly from 509 BC to 27 BC, around 500 years, roughly twice the length of the period that the United States has been in existence. And Machiavelli sought to draw lessons learned from what happened in the Roman Republic. A couple of things that are instructive that relate, I think, to Afghanistan. One is that countries that have lost liberty or haven't known liberty and have not known a republican form of government, once they've lost it, it's very difficult to recover it. In Afghanistan's case, they've never had it, and so I think we're being a little bit naive in thinking that we can in some way over the next several years encourage them to develop a republican form of government that will be lasting. Another thing he mentions, he had this concept of virtue, not virtue, but virtue, which I kind of take it to mean the goodness of the people. And he pointed out that once a people becomes corrupt, meaning not good, not corrupt in the criminal state, but corrupt meaning that a people have forgotten how to be good, how to act properly in a civilized manner governed by some sort of an elected government. And so once a people has been corrupt, it's very difficult to go back on that. And I think it's safe to say that on many levels, Afghan government and the country of Afghanistan is corrupt. And to think that we can return it to something that isn't corrupt is difficult to say. A large part of becoming corrupt or getting out of corruption is that you've got a generation of people, citizens in your country, that remember what it was to be good or not corrupt. That doesn't exist there. In fact, we're having our own problems in the United States where we're running out of people that understand how this country is supposed to be run. So that's another level, and I highly recommend that you pull out a copy of Discourses, which is free on the internet, by Machiavelli, and it's broken up into small chapters, and I highly recommend that you go ahead and give it a read. It's well worth it and very instructive about our own situation. The other thing is that I think there's some very interesting parallels between our situation and a situation that existed in the early to mid 1800s in Afghanistan. Britain, which had taken over India, had moved into Afghanistan and was trying to civilize Afghanistan, which is, if you want to know what Afghanistan was like back in the early 1800s, you can just look at what it is right now, and it hasn't changed all that much. So it came to a point where the British were negotiating with the Kabul government to stay there and couldn't come to an agreement, but they could come to an agreement that British forces that were stationed or garrisoned in Kabul in the 1840s, early 1840s, would be given safe passage out of the country and they could return to India. So it became a little bit desperate. There's a garrison of roughly 4,500 soldiers living in Kabul, and they had 12,000 family members, wives, children, and servants that were working with them. We call them civilian contractors now, but they were called camp followers back in the 1800s. And so they negotiated with the Kabul government to get safe passage. Well, unfortunately, as you know, Afghanistan is a tribal society, and the tribes between Kabul and Jalalabad were not cut in on the agreement. And so this group of roughly 16,000 people, 4,500 troops, 12,000 civilians, set out in early January of 1842 to march from Kabul to Jalalabad, roughly 100 kilometers. Well, as you know from recent history, they don't like to fight in the wintertime because it's darn cold and it snows and it's just plain nasty in Afghanistan during the winter. Well, January, a lot of those people were suffered from exposure and died en route to Jalalabad. The rest of them were slaughtered. They were surrounded and slaughtered. And I'll show you a couple of pictures. For many years, it was believed that only one person out of the 16,000 that left Kabul survived. And he was allowed to survive as a way of telling the rest of the world what it was like in Afghanistan. His name was... Here is one of the more famous paintings of Afghan history, recent history. It's a painting entitled Last Stand of the 44th Regiment at Gundamuk by William Burns Woolen. It's painted in 1898, and it shows the final 45 members of a regiment of 4,500 who escaped Kabul and tried to escape to Jalalabad, and this shows them just before they were surrounded and slaughtered. The next is another famous painting by Elizabeth Butler, painted in 1879, entitled Remnants of an Army, and it shows Dr. William Bryden, one of the regimental surgeons, and at the time believed to be the only survivor of the 16,000 people that were marching from Kabul to Jalalabad in that winter of 1842. And it shows his horse just to be as it approaches the garrison in Jalalabad, and reportedly the horse died as soon as the doctor reached the fort. In summary, in addition to reading some of the discourses by Machiavelli, you might want to look up things like the First, Second, Third, and Fourth Anglo-Afghan Wars, with emphasis on the First Anglo-Afghan War, in which people like Dr. Bryden survived to tell the world what he went through. What I've concluded from these kind of seemingly unrelated bits of history is that while it may appeal to our sense of do-goodedness to stay and help the Afghans, history doesn't show that it's going to result in success. And in my opinion, rather than leaving behind a small garrison that could be easily surrounded, overwhelmed, and murdered, much like the Anglo garrison of 1842, it would be better for us to leave Afghanistan completely. And hopefully there are enough Afghans remaining that will have derived some lessons or some benefits from their experience over the last several years, so that they will want in themselves to form a republic of some kind, so that they can govern themselves peacefully and become part of what we consider to be the civilized world.